tend to penalize people, say, who don't express their pain in ways that we value, right? You've overexpressed your pain. You've underexpressed your pain. You haven't expressed your pain. You're nagging me about your pain. That in and of itself is problematic. Like, listen to someone's pain. That's part of not the Hippocratic Oath, but the Oath of Maimonides. So, I think I don't really know where I'm going with that one, except for like people express pain in many different ways, and just because they're telling a joke doesn't mean they're not in pain.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Sonika Garcia.
And I'm Brad Davidson, and this is Breaking the Code,
a podcast that takes the BS out of behavioral science for marketers and non-marketers alike. We hope to arm you, our listeners, with the tools you need to make sense of behavioral science and to help you apply it to your work as communication extraordinaires. Welcome to episode 32. Today, we're going to be talking all about culture and how it shapes the way that we tell stories, specifically how we use emotion in storytelling. Obviously, this is really important to the work that we do. We are storytellers, but we also are tasked with understanding storytellers to be able to communicate and create solutions for them, whether it be patient stories, HCP stories, and really just understanding people's experiences. So, for example, as it applies to health, understanding how someone living in Singapore is living with and dealing with a rare disease and how they talk about the challenges that they face, comparing that to someone who's living with the same rare disease in rural Mississippi is important for us to know because we are a global network and we do research and have to really uncover these insights. So it's a topic that we've been talking about a lot, and we kind of want to start the discussion today and of course continue it as we kind of evolve this thinking and find more research behind it. So
it's a big topic. I don't think we're going to get through like cultural emotions and different cultural tendencies and patterns of storytelling and stuff. Like that's just a huge topic, but it's super, super relevant to how we think about health and health delivery and wellness and all the rest of it. So yeah, it's hugely important.
And I think it's interesting. I mean, I know, like, obviously as social scientists, I think we know that there are differences in the way that different cultures express things like pain or things related to their health condition. So we know that, but I think understanding certain nuances in language and dialogue, which I know, Brad, you have a lot more experience in, but having the tools to really understand the diversity in communication, specifically in emotion, because that's something that we are so interested in within healthcare marketing. So, pain, for example, how do we talk about it? What are the cultural influences of how we talk about it? Personal influences. I think sometimes language fails us. Language can be limiting in the way that we understand, the way that we express, and the way that people understand us.
There's so much there, and to your point, like this is sort of what I really studied in many ways as a medical anthropologist starting out in my career, is not only how do people talk about what bothers them or their health and their wellness, but the disconnects between culturally appropriate ways of talking about things like pain. What really kicked this off was a discussion around the sort of known emergency room phenomenon where the culture you come from, perceived by the emergency room workers themselves, will filter how they view your expressions of pain. If you come from a culture that is known to the emergency room staff as a histrionic culture, and again, like put air quotes around all of this, right? But this is like real, this happens every day in emergency rooms. The problem is there's both truth to the idea that certain cultures express pain more verbally than others, but also individuals don't and occupations don't. And so it's hard to look at somebody, say, from a Hispanic background, which is sort of really the one that I'm trading off of right now. In New York City, in Washington Heights, for example, you'll get residents being taught, if someone comes in screaming in pain, you better make sure that they're actually in pain and not just screaming, kind of thing, right? And there's a lot of quite racist ways of expressing that. There's terms that I won't repeat on air, but that'll basically say like this person is in Hispanic pain, something like that. Now, is there some truth to the idea that in certain Caribbean cultures, it's a little bit louder in how you express yourself? That part's well studied. There's no question that that's true, that people in general, volumetrically, space-wise, those sorts of things take up a little bit more space than, say, the English. But that doesn't mean that people always express pain exactly the same way from the same cultural band. One of the challenges of pain is that it's utterly subjective and idiosyncratic. Some people have high tolerance for pain individually, some people don't. Some of that is tied to valuing being, like handling pain. So for example, you might come from a background that's one way, where like a little bit more voluble about how you feel about pain, but then you might be in the military or you might work in construction sites, these sort of like very uber male places where complaining about being hurt is taught out of you very quickly. And so you have this mix of like, do I view myself as strong? Do I view myself as like trying to express it and get it out of my body by expressing it as loudly as possible? There's a lot of beliefs about pain. And one of the things we know, regardless of how you view pain or even how you view what I said, you could come back and go like, none of that's true. What we absolutely know is that it's very difficult to get a handle on what kind of pain somebody's feeling. And that, in spite of how many efforts we've made to simplify it in the clinical setting, with the sort of smiley face to frowny face, to pain scales 1 to 10, making pain a vital sign, making sure that you're checking on people's pains all the time. The reality is, pain is sort of a performance in some ways. We're reading pain on people, and I've told you the story that we have 3 kids, and when we had 2 of them, the first one was much more expressive about his pain than the second one, which meant that we almost missed like a ruptured eardrum, because by the time we brought our second infant in for like just sort of rubbing his ear a little bit, the doctor said both of his ears are infected and could have burst. We had no idea because we were keying off the first kid we had who, at the first sign of ear infection, was really letting us know very loudly, right? And so you've got individual differences. You've also got things like pre-framing. So there's a big article this week or this past week on IUD insertion, just a pinch. And that there's a TikTok campaign going now of women showing their faces during the quote, just a pinch of IUD insertion, because it's not just a pinch. And for some people, it's very painful. And sort of telling people, oh, it's just going to be, you'll feel just a little bit of a cramp, or I think it was cramp, not pinch, whatever it was. Whatever it was, the descriptor was seen as underselling the potential for the pain. And the question becomes, well, do you want your doctor to tell you like it's going to hurt like the Dickens? That pre-frames an expectation. Or do you want the doctor to go, it's not going to hurt that much, and then you're not ready for it at all? And so there's no right answer to that. But there is a TikTok going on now about how if you film yourself getting your IUD inserted, just your face, right? Obviously, not the private parts, and show the sort of like startle, that will help people understand what's coming. It might not, but it's an interesting one that like you're really talking about your expectations setting what you feel, which is fascinating. And I think that's much more your world than mine. I think in terms of stories, I'll tell one more small story, but an academic one, to talk a little bit about emotions and story and culture, because we haven't really talked about stories, but stories are how we connect facts and how they make sense of the world, right? We seem driven to create just so stories, like why things happen. And we use them as well to describe the appropriate ways of reacting to things like grief. There's a very famous story by an anthropologist named Renato Rosaldo called Grief and a Headhunter's Rage. And the very short version of it is, he and his first wife were studying in Borneo, I believe, headhunters. And the explanation the headhunters were giving was that when grief was overwhelming, they would go take a head and they would put their grief in that head. And Renato Rosaldo describes this as something that he saw as transactional, and he tried to use a lot of different sort of anthropological frameworks for understanding it. And then his wife slipped on a mountain trail, fell hundreds of feet, and died right in front of him. And he said, for the first time, I fully understood what they meant by grief and rage and wanting to take a head. That he had been in the country long enough and had been studying them long enough that his instinct for how to place his grief was, maybe I should go take a head, right? Obviously, had he stayed in, and I don't know where Renato's from, but had he stayed at Stanford and never left California, the first thought wouldn't be, let's go take a head, right? So in some ways, you can see how like grief mediated through rage then turns into action, then turns into something that I can do to put this away, becomes very symbolic. I'm not encouraging anybody to go take a head, but what I am saying is his point was he was unable to understand this equation of grief leading to peace until he personally experienced it. And I think that's just true across the board, that what we feel, then how we express it, being culturally mediated in the stories we tell, and then having culturally appropriate ways of dealing with that, even if, appropriate is a sort of stretch in some cases, we then get to the point where we go, there's really no such thing as a natural reaction to, say, grief or pain. Everything is filtered through our understanding of what's the right way of expressing this thing. And then it becomes more complicated when you get into a clinical setting and you're trying to say, get drugs, right, to relieve your pain, because then they go, are you drug seeking or are you not? And so it becomes very, very difficult in a multicultural clinic, and every clinic today is multicultural because we are a nation of recent immigrants in many ways. You're really talking about people whose standard norms of expression are just at odds with each other, or are not at least titrated identically. So you start pulling this thread, and all of a sudden it becomes an entire worldview of pain. It becomes much harder to think of a solution to. So I guess the first learning from all of this is it's nowhere near as simple as you would think. And very often doctors will tell you things like, well, they're not really in pain if they're not taking their pain meds. That's not true, right? There might be many reasons why people don't, but there's a lot to unpack in that. But there's just so much going on with sort of translating nonverbal feelings to words, both structurally and just individual words. Like, what does pain mean?
Well, that's interesting. And it kind of brings me back to like thinking about, well, if the question is, how is grief impacting you? Because I think like therapists and even like primary care doctors, people working in any area of mental health, like that's a very common topic that's brought up. It's the difference between someone saying, how does grief impact you? It makes me want to take a head, versus makes me want to, I don't want to be alive anymore. And it's something just, you take it to yourself, versus like, something that you would inflict on somebody else. Like, I think even little things like, I mean, they're not little, but like it's how you view yourself in the ecosystem of like grief. And
I mean, if we're going to talk about grief, and this is a total side note, so I'll just sort of like dip a toe in and then I'll back off. Like, I don't think we had a good ritual to grieve all the things we lost for pandemic, right? I had a child who graduated high school in the middle of pandemic. I had a child who left middle school in a very small private school and entered high school in the middle of pandemic. She never got to say goodbye to anybody from that school. And they shut down, and we never saw many of them again, because by the time it opened back up, many of them had moved on. It's a longer story, right? But like, there was a lot that we lost during pandemic. People lost their senior year of high school, their senior year of college, their weddings, their honeymoons. We lost a lot. People, I mean, notably, people lost the ability to hold hands of their loved one while they passed away. One of my dad's college roommates passed away, and his wife wasn't allowed in the hospital. So I'm worried that we haven't actually had any sort of national or even global ritual to rid ourselves of that grief. Like, we all are short one head, as it were, like if we're going to use that. But yeah, it's very complicated how we feel and how we then sort of turn that feeling into action.
Yeah, it's interesting. And something that I'll talk about quickly, just in doing research on this topic, because there's, like you said, so much to uncover. There was an article in The Behavioral Scientist. It's an online blog that I personally love. And it was an article that was titled How Culture Shapes the Stories That We Tell About Our Emotions. The whole premise of what the researchers did with that study was they were interested in how different people express common experiences differently, like specifically in relation to the emotion that they express. And so they had interviewed people living in North America and Western Europe, and they found, a lot of similarities naturally, I think, especially in the English speaking countries. And they thought, this is a very small sample size. Let's, get a completely different perspective. And they ended up going to Tanzania and interviewing a community that was a hunter and gatherer community to understand how they story tell about difficult experiences and how emotion shows up for them. In that specific study, they ended up finding out that those living in Tanzania, those individuals who they spoke to, their stories about grief and pain and frustration and unpleasant sort of experiences, they used emotion in the sense of explaining like a physical experience. So like pain, like it felt like my head was going to explode or my arm
Right.
got chopped off. It was very like, let me translate what's inside to like what's on the outside. Whereas those in the US and in parts of Europe kept it very emotional, like internally emotional. So, I felt frustrated. I felt taken advantage of. I felt, those sorts of explanations, and we'll link the article because I think it's a really interesting one.
It is
But
that stuff's so interesting. Yeah.
well, and then even more than just that, like they ended up finding out through a larger meta-analysis and like a larger research study, that there are so many different ways that people express emotion, and not just in grief, but like in different stories. So like I'll just talk about a few, and I'm still kind of digging into the research. I think there's a lot there, but like I said, physical versus mental. People describe things as like how it's impacting their community. So like how I'm able to provide for my family, or how this is impacting loved ones or people in my community. So like a shared experience is highlighted versus some people talk more about like an individual experience being
Right.
highlighted,
Right.
which I think is interesting and something there. Sometimes like more immediate needs are in focus, and sometimes it's more of like an
This
abstract
stuff
goal.
is this stuff is so hard to get a handle on too, because especially when you start talking about non-Indo-European languages and really getting into different grammatical structures. There's Bill Hanks was the chair of the Department of Linguistics out at Berkeley for a while. He's a linguistic anthropologist, but his big thing is on like referential practice among the Maya and how they refer to like time and place and space. And basically, no matter what Bill says, I don't understand it because I don't speak Mayan, and he's translating it into English, and he's trying to use English language to refer to sort of Mayan concepts that he fully understands. The basic point is the language we use and the culture we use shape how we perceive time, shape how we perceive place, not just like the boundaries of place, but what place is, right? Pain is one of those things where there's metaphorical pain, the pain of loss, the pain of missing someone, the pain of grief. That is very different than the pain of sticking a nail through your foot, right? Like that actually is physical pain. That's the non-metaphorical pain. And we have an open question as to like psychosomatic pain, referred pain, phantom pain, established pain, neuropathic pain. We have all these words for the mechanisms of pain, real biological pain and metaphorical pain. But when it comes to describing your own pain, the vocabulary doesn't translate. You can use the words, but I won't understand it. You could tell me what it was like to go through labor and delivery. I won't understand it. All I will be able to do as a medical professional is go, should I intervene or shouldn't I? It's just so complicated. It becomes very complicated to give like, quote, culturally appropriate care, because it is not possible to know the worldview of every human who walks into your office. You just have to try.
Yeah, and bringing it back to like something really important, the whole like if you're a doctor lens, how can you understand different cultures and how they express themselves? But I think also just from like a research standpoint, I think a lot of times we're used to doing like research in the Western world and the science on emotion and interpreting research to create an output. And what we end up doing is thinking that the way that we express emotion is the norm, but it's not, because we see that many cultures express it differently as this hunters and gatherers community. But I think it's important to find a more sophisticated way and like more sophisticated tools for really understanding the stories that people tell and like what to pay attention for, because I don't think that we have that just yet. I think if we try to fit everyone's like narrative of pain and experiences into a certain bucket, it feels like their experiences might fall flat. And it's like, okay, so like it's not emotional enough, so it must not feel serious enough, or it must not
Right.
be serious enough. But that's not
Yeah.
necessarily the case, because even coming off unemotional, you have to know what to listen for and how a certain culture is
Yeah.
actually expressing a very emotional situation.
So that's
Because
a rugby ball over my shoulder there, and I'm a rugby coach, and that's an ethos of you don't complain, you know,
yeah,
like you have to be injured to complain. And they make a big distinction between hurt and injured. Hurt is an owie, injured is you can't continue. Are you hurt or are you injured? If you're hurt, shut up. But all of
right.
this sort of makes it as well like unidirectional. So I want to tee Gabe up a little bit here, because the other thing we talked about is sometimes people just make fun of their own pain. Like that's a very legitimate coping mechanism. Comics do it all the time. Basically they're metaphorical emotional pain, right? But people making jokes about the pain that they've suffered and trauma bonding is 100% a standard approach in the West. And I would assume it's global.
Yeah. So one of the things that was interesting for me as I was reading through, and for some reason, maybe I'm blaming it on April Fool's Day, and I'm thinking about humor and how it relates to pain and everything like that, not just to make a big tonal shift out of nowhere in the middle of the episode. But I think about humor as far as a feature in storytelling. I think that humor for internal, it's like I get to decide how I tell my story. This is going to be funny to me because I consciously decided that it's going to be funny. It's a way of reframing circumstances to either make yourself feel better or even disillusion yourself. I think that there's a bit of a ambiguity with humor that we may touch on a little later when it comes to being the listener and the receiver of stories where people use humor. But just as an outset, for the individual who's being humorous, I see it as a way of control, as a way of telling the story.
Interesting. Yeah, if I can laugh at it, it doesn't have power.
Right,
You know?
right. And Brad, I know you said you had a story about trauma bonding, so we could tag team this part. But one of the things I'm thinking, like externally, when I use humor, and I'm thinking about Gen Z in particular for this example, just because I was doing a lot of digging, and one of the things I found was like in the midst of the pandemic, Vice did a study of Gen Z during the pandemic, how they're coping. And I found that 72% back in April of 2020, so 4 years ago, pandemic just hit, everything just shut down. Gen Z said that memes will make them feel capable of getting them through the pandemic. I think that that's, and I don't want to jump ahead and I don't want to jump over your story, Brad, but I think that there's something there where Gen Z, when they share these things online and it's this community that they build, I think humor also facilitates making friends and making connections easier than
Yeah.
just, I'm going to offload my trauma onto you and you take it and then you do the same thing to me.
It's about trauma bonding, but two things occurred to me. Are memes the Gen Z equivalent of taking a head? And the other is, I think that sense of control, right? When linguists look at narrative structures, for example, one of the filters that we might look at is agency. Do you position yourself as somebody who does things, or do you position yourself as somebody to whom things happen? And one of the things about humor is it at least allows you to take it and turn it back around and, put it in fate's face or someone's face that like, I'm not going to let this beat me. Right. And the other is, and I don't even know where to put this, but it was just funny because you had brought up trauma. You had used the word trauma bonding, and I'm, like everyone spending far too much time on, videos and stuff these days. And there's a guy I follow who's been in the military, and he's so funny. And he talks about things like, if you've been in the military, you'll understand why you could stand in the rain at your new job for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and not complain, but be very upset if you lost your special card that gets you in the building and stuff. Like, I've never been in the military, but I assume these are things that would make sense. But someone apparently, he told the story about someone sent a therapist to them, and they all basically just told the most horrible jokes. And the therapist finally left and said, "I can't help any of you." And then they cracked up laughing and went and had a beer. And he said it was the most therapeutic thing we'd ever done. Right. But like somehow breaking the therapist's will to therapize them was successful for them. Right. And I just, it's hard to feel as a therapist, I'm sure, that you did any good, but according to this guy, it was the best therapy session they'd ever had, because they just all ganged up on her and sort of wanted to see how far they could tell like dark jokes to prove how broken they were. So I'm not saying that's a good thing. Any therapists who are listening, I'm not saying that's a wonderful thing, but it did strike me as very similar to what you were talking about, that at least I can acknowledge my own pain to the degree that I can share it with other people who've had the same pain, and we can make a joke out of it. And I think that is a very common thread in dark humor, that we're basically taking something that could be seen as just horrible, and we're trying to make light of it. And, I think that is culturally mediated. Like, I think in this culture, very quickly, very early on, we learn that other people's pain can be funny, and then we try and unlearn it. We tend to penalize people, say, who don't express their pain in ways that we value, right? You've overexpressed your pain. You've underexpressed your pain. You haven't expressed your pain. You're nagging me about your pain. We've done studies of women in pain, right? And like doctors will say, like, I just don't want to hear another complaining migraine patient. Just these women are unsatisfiable. Like, that in and of itself is problematic. Like, listen to someone's pain. That's part of not the Hippocratic oath, but the oath of Maimonides. So, I think I don't really know where I'm going with that one, except for like, people express pain in many different ways. And just because they're telling a joke doesn't mean they're not in pain.
Yeah. And I think that kind of drives home the point at the end with talking about the listeners. Like, how do we interpret this author, this speaker's pain? Or at least the way they're telling it. Is it humor to destigmatize, or is it humor to trivialize? Right.
Right.
One of the things that comes up for me from your story was like the listener aspect of it, and I started to get into it a little bit. But even me, like, if you were to go back to that example with Gen Z and their memes and everything like that, 72% said it helped them get through the pandemic. If I see a meme from my friend about World War III, that doesn't convey to me every single thing about their anxiety and their fear. Whereas if they then pull me to the side and talk about all those things, like, I don't want to get drafted, man, this is really scary. I think that instead of, like you were saying, like Sanika was saying earlier in the conversation, instead of taking that meme and dismissing it, we can use both in aggregate to get a full understanding of everything about how this person is working, and to tie it into the medical aspect, at least from how I see it, it's like what we say, you are more than your pain. You are more than your illness. So even in how you express it, if we go into research, for example, expecting Gen Z, for example, to express their mental health in very, systematic, this is what's happening to me, this is how I'm coping with it ways, and we're bombarded with memes, one thought could be, well, they don't take mental health seriously. What's the big deal here? When it could really be like, what's actually going on here? Why is it struggling to talk about it? Because humor is a way to cope, but I find it as a way to talk around an issue instead of talking about it. It's to make the difficult lighter and easier to talk about. So I think as listeners, at least as researchers, it's taking everything in aggregate, just not just what we expect to see and the emotion that we expect to come through, but even if someone's trying to be funny, even if we interpret it as a little morbid, I think there's a method to the madness, if you will.
I feel like that's a great point to kind of wrap up on, and that like we need to and you both touched on it, we need better ways to understand and capture, the richness and the value in different descriptors of emotion and pain, even if it's not the way that we would describe things or the way that we're used to hearing things described, specifically as in our role as marketers and social scientists. And then bringing it back to health, I think, how should an HCP or any sort of solutions provider interact with a patient who focuses more on, let's say, physical versus psychological impact of disease. If we are thinking about like treatment goals, immediate treatment goals versus like a more abstract goal. Well, both of those things are valid, but how do we understand them appropriately to be able to really understand what it means to like improve quality of life and things like that? And then for marketers, how do we take all of that and create communications and interventions, keeping in mind, these nuanced differences in the way that people are explaining? And once again, how do we have more sophisticated research analysis methods?
I think, I think self-reported pain scales and all the rest of it, they're the best we've got. But one thing that I would really encourage us to do is think that the biology is much simpler for doctors to understand right now than the rest of it, right? Like, and as visits get shorter and shorter and shorter, you really are in a transactional space where, everything that, Gabe, you were talking about, and Sanika, you were talking about, and I was talking about, there's almost no chance you're going to pick up on any of that in an 11-minute visit, right? What you're left with is the biological measures of the tests. And is it working, right? So think about antidepressants, How do you know if someone's less depressed unless you really talk to them and understand, Gabe, to your point, like how they use humor, how they personally use humor, how their culture uses humor. This is where, cultural competence becomes so difficult to measure. It's idiosyncratic. It is group oriented. It is about what you've learned. I am reminded that I spent 6 months in a very multicultural public health clinic in Northern California for my dissertation. And I remember walking out going, I know less than when I started as to what the right answer is. So, we've talked throughout the year and a half we've had this podcast about things like culturally mediated appropriate medical interaction. Some people want a doctor who's sort of like kind of very removed from them. It makes them feel safe, makes them much more capable of expressing themselves, So it comes down to, a lot of the stuff that we deal with right now is about quality of life. Are people, living their best life, as the kids say? And it's hard to know. It's really hard to know. We can measure the biology. It's hard to measure the illness part, the sort of lived experience part. And it's so much more complicated than people give it credit for. But I'm not even sure what this podcast was about anymore. I think it was about pain and storytelling and cross-culturalism, but it's probably about all of that. And, good places I need to wrap. I'm Brad Davidson.
I'm Sanika Garcia.
And I'm Gabriel Allen Cummings.
Until next time, thanks for listening.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Breaking the Code is a podcast created and produced by Havas Health and U's Medical Anthropology Department. Hosted by Brad Davidson and Sanika Garcia. Content and post-production audio editing done by Gabriel Allen Cummings. And inspiration from all of you. Thank you for listening and for your continued support. If you enjoy these episodes, we would love to hear from you. Please leave a rating, subscribe, and send us a message to our mailbox at medicalanthropology@havas.com. Until next time.